what we're trying to do is put money in the hands of climate entrepreneurs,
Mm,
whether it's our money or not. So if you think about climate change as a problem that we have decided to solve through capitalism,
hmm.
which like arguably we have,
Yes.
it requires an insane amount of investment. And it's, estimates vary, but probably around 10 trillion a year in the flows of capital. And that's distributed across lots of different sources. So you have money coming from government, you have money coming from the private sector, you have money coming from consumers, but the overall, like, quote unquote investment is 10 trillion a year. And we're like, I don't know, an eighth, a tenth of the way there.
Yeah. Hmm.
And that's in order to stay below 2 degrees C. That's not to like stop climate change. That's to like stay below the threshold where it gets even more ugly than it's already going to be.
Yeah.
And so one of the places where we see these gaps is for smaller, earlier, more innovative companies and for the call it like small, medium sized business community,
Yeah.
where those gaps exist across every industry.
Hmm.
But in climate, it is particularly unacceptable that money should not be available to the people doing the work
Yeah.
because our existence depends on it. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve.
Dimitry Gershenson is the CEO and co-founder of Enduring Planet. Enduring Planet, if you're unfamiliar, provides fast, flexible, and founder-friendly working capital to climate entrepreneurs. They also provide financial advisory services. We'll dig into what that means and how it can help you in today's episode. Dimitry is not by any means new to neither raising capital or deploying it, nor the energy sector at large. He's also worked at Rango Wireless. Before that, he built Meta's energy access program and has a ton of experience in developing nations. In fact, one of the commonalities that he and I share are we're both returned Peace Corps volunteers. Of course, we'll dig into Dimitri's background as we always do. With that in context, would you introduce us to Enduring Planet and how particularly you've aligned it to solve the problem you've just enunciated?
Enduring Planet is a fintech company. So we're not a fund, although a lot of people look at us and they think we look like a fund. We're a fintech company, so we build technology to help address this problem, but we also provide working capital to climate entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
And now we also provide what we call like financial advisory services to climate entrepreneurs. So it's this platform with this broader mission of ensuring that climate entrepreneurs have the capital they need to be successful. And currently, there are these two distinct but very related and interconnected sort of lines of business. But over time, the goal is to have lots of different credit products that we offer climate entrepreneurs. So we are a lender. We provide debt capital, not
Right.
equity capital. And then also a basket of these services that enable founders to access more capital, enable them to manage that capital effectively, enable them to really navigate the financing journey of a climate business from inception to IPO late stage, right? Because those needs, they change, they evolve, they get more complex. And most entrepreneurs that we've met, unless they come from a really substantial sort of finance background, they're kind of figuring it out as they go along.
Yeah.
And choices about money may not always seem material to founders. They're like, money's money. But in the end, they have really profound implications on how that business grows and succeeds over time. And I think that in climate, there's kind of less room for error and there's more urgency and there's greater opportunity cost of failure. And so the question that we ask ourselves every day is like, how do we help climate entrepreneurs solve that next financing challenge so they can do the thing they want to do, get the impact that they want in the world, and like bring us closer to that 1.5, 2 degree C world. that we can.
You, as the COO of Rango Wireless, operating under Enduring Ventures, Enduring Ventures being the portfolio of venture capital that Enduring Planet is now a part of. How did you evaluate the landscape of the kind of capital maybe that Rango needed, that it ultimately led you to say, this is the kind of channel of capital that entrepreneurs need, and Enduring Ventures should do that?
Yeah, so I think it might help to take a couple steps back because context matters, right? So I've been working in climate for around 15 years, and a lot of my initial work was in emerging markets where the capital landscape is even more complex and challenging. And I ended up at Facebook, where I built the Energy Access Program there and ran it for about 3.5 years. And one of our key pillars was advancing the flows of finance into rural electrification in emerging markets as a driver of connectivity, right? You can't connect the world if people don't have power. You can't build infrastructure to connect the world. You can't get people devices so they can access the internet and eventually get on Facebook. Like, none of that is possible without power.
Yeah.
And when you have like 1.5 billion people, arguably at the time, without electricity, like, money was one of the biggest problems. And so what we did was we deployed a lot of catalytic finance to financial intermediaries who were channeling funding into the space. So we would provide them risk capital, and they would then go to private capital markets, raise a lot more money, leveraging our funds, put that to work, rinse and repeat. And so that's where I like really started to think about the power of risk tolerant money in unlocking much larger financial flows. And you can see the same in residential solar in the US, right? There was a time when resi solar was not a thing because it was not being financed. And then folks started to play around with structures, and there were catalytic capital providers who worked with players like Mosaic, et cetera, where they said, hey, we'll fund the risk up front to show the big financial institutions that actually this is a very investable asset. And that's how that industry grew. And you can see this across any new market. There's often these players who come in and they say, hey, we'll take risk, disproportionate risk, because we see the social value that this sort of financial ecosystem will create. And that's kind of how I got into this universe of like, okay, how do you create a market where a market does not exist? How do you create financial flows in a place where it does not exist? How do you prove that to large institutional investors who have endless money that a space is worth investing in? And so I did that work at Facebook for, I did it in Energy Access for 3.5 years. We also did it in, we like created a credit fund for women e-commerce entrepreneurs in emerging markets who were building on the marketplace platform because they also had no working capital. And so like, I like saw this in a couple of different places. And then I left Facebook. I joined Enduring Ventures as an operating partner and sort of led acquisitions into this portfolio of rural infrastructure, rural internet businesses. This was Rango Wireless. And I also helped incubate our first, out of Enduring Ventures, our first venture studio company, which is also in climate. I actually still sit on the board of that. And so I got to see their early financing journey as they ramped up. And then at Rango, I think, like, we had to finance a crap ton of infrastructure. And so we looked at federal subsidies, we looked at credit markets, we looked at equity markets to build this like fairly CapEx intensive business. And when I had sort of run these acquisitions and taken over this portfolio, and then we brought in a seasoned telco exec to really run the business. And so I stepped out. And I had this opportunity to like decide what I could do next. And the Enduring Ventures team said, look, we want to support you to build whatever company you want to build. Like, we've loved working with you. What do you want to build? Right. Out of the venture studio. As long as it's like venture backable, we're down, And I was like, well, I don't want to do anything outside of climate. And I am so frustrated with the like climate finance ecosystem. It needs to change.
Yeah.
And so what does a venture backable business in climate finance even look like? I think that for me was like the starting point, right? It's like I could build a fund or I could build a $1 billion company. Like, how do I what does that even look like? And it became pretty apparent that there was this opportunity to not only be like a frontline, innovative capital provider, but to really build a platform that sits at the center of this like climate finance ecosystem
Yeah.
and helps to kind of lubricate the flows.
Yeah.
Because one of the biggest problems is in climate, you like can't really wait for capitalism to catch up. You kind of have to force it. And so this is what the IRA does. The IRA is risk capital. It says, hey, we want $5 trillion to flow into the US clean energy market. We're going to subsidize the crap out of it.
Yeah.
And that way investors can, where, maybe they're like, oh, my risk adjusted return needs to be 25 because we're worried about the space. Like, oh, now it's like much, much smaller.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're kind of trying to do the same thing, but for the startup and SMB ecosystem, both in the US and internationally, to say, okay, how do we get the money to flow here? Because these are the people who will be big, who will be having that large impact in 3, 5, 10 years that we need to have.
Is there an analogous description for Enduring Planet? The X for climate, right? Like the something that in another industry you compare yourself against?
I often reference SoFi as a kind of comparable business. Obviously it's like a very different model. They are consumer lenders and now a consumer bank, and they have all of these like wealth management services. But in the end, they are credit plus services for like a set of consumers, right? In this case, like kind of like upper middle class to higher net income Americans, right?
Yep.
And so we're like SoFi, but for climate entrepreneurs.
Perfect. Great. What solutions, when you stepped into that venture studio moment and you decided, okay, I want to really crack the nut on this. When you surveyed the landscape, what solutions existed for climate entrepreneurs?
It depends on how you draw the box, right? So there's, I think, a lot of really interesting stuff happening in the project finance ecosystem in later stages, like more mature projects, second, third, fourth project. It's relatively straightforward to get financing now. There's a lot of like innovative structures to get money to flow into those spaces. There's obviously way more capital needed, but the framework is really there, I think.
Yeah.
It's less true for more frontier technologies and like first of a kind financing. That is now starting to shift, and there's, I think, really exciting things happening in what people call FOAK, FOAK, first of a kind, like project finance.
What's FOAK? For those who don't
first of a kind project finance. That's an incredibly difficult space to work in, innovate in. It's like large ticket amounts, large risk, low track record. It's like a lot of really creative structuring and
it's
work
like,
that needs to happen.
Yeah, carbon capture and hydrogen projects. First,
there's so much. There's so much. I think another thing that we sort of saw early was that the carbon markets were starting to get more and more interesting around like what's financeable, forward contracts, pre-purchase contracts, like all of this stuff in carbon. And initially, actually, we were going to start Enduring Planet as a carbon finance business.
Yeah.
But after I spent just a month talking to both sellers and buyers, I realized that there was like no way that we could reasonably predict pricing, volume, or quality of offsets.
Yeah.
And that seemed like a bad place to like do investments if you can't predict those things. But I think for us, the sort of like exciting realization was that there is this general trend in climate, which is that the industry is kind of moving in only one direction now.
Yeah.
Like it's only going to get bigger, and it's only going to get more capital.
Yeah.
And it's only going to have more procurement and purchasing by institutions and government, it's only going to move in one direction.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who gets elected. I don't care what people say. Like the world's on fucking fire.
That's right. It doesn't
and it's
matter.
only going to go one way.
Yeah.
And if you operate from that framework, then like building a business that offers credit as early as physically possible while managing risk becomes really interesting.
Yeah.
Because then you're growing with this industry, and the people that work with you, they tend to come back.
Yeah.
Right. If you're doing like mortgage lending to consumers, like how many houses is a household going to buy? You're probably going to have one, the customer's going to borrow from you once on average.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In our case, like if we're working with an early enough stage company and we offer them a product that works in their early days, and then we offer them more and more kind of similar but related, different instruments over time, they don't want to go to anyone else because we're solving the problem that they have. And so that became really interesting. It's like, how do we build a business that kind of scales with the industry over time?
So I want to try to figure out where, if I am in the market as a climate tech entrepreneur, where I see Enduring Planet along the spectrum of other potential capital partners, right? And so early stage hardware, early stage even software often will look at venture capital, especially if they're pre-revenue. And then there are like project finance type things where maybe traditional banks or even nouveau banks like Atmos with Robbie and those guys, or Mercury, McGee at Watt Carbon turned me on to Mercury. I'm a huge fan actually.
Yeah.
And they have products. As a fintech company that is affiliated with the bank, they have products that offer working capital, that offer loans, et cetera. Help me understand kind of where you see Enduring Planet in that spectrum, and how, as an entrepreneur, how and when I would turn to Enduring Planet versus some of the other opportunities.
Yeah. So today we offer a unique product that is not readily available in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So we provide working capital to companies that win state or federal grants. That's our like flagship, the Climate Grant Advance. And for anyone who's ever won a grant from state or federal government, they know that those are generally reimbursement based. So you have to do the work to get paid, which means you kind of have to have the money to get the money. And that's often really difficult because the whole point of winning the grant is that you need the money. And so what we do is we provide entirely non-dilutive, so no warrants, no like weird conversion stuff. We provide debt capital where we say, hey, you have $500,000 coming out of this DOE grant over the next 12 months. We'll give you $400,000 today.
Yeah.
And you can spend it on the grant and then get reimbursed. And whatever the cost of that capital, you bear the cost. The grant doesn't bear it.
Right.
But we're basically buying, providing you liquidity for a pretty cheap rate.
Right.
And
because the hurdle to draw down on that grant can often take 6 or more months before you can even draw a penny.
Yeah. So there's a lot of these, like, this is one of the things that I think a lot of folks don't understand when they win one of these grants, right? One is your budget is sort of dependent on the reimbursement schedule.
Yes.
Which means that if you have work that you could do in 9 months, but because of the reimbursement timeline, it takes you 18. Like if you had the money up front, you could do it in 9.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really powerful, especially if you're a venture-backed or venture-backable company. Like getting to that next milestone where you prove something about your technology in half the time is just priceless.
Yes.
Right? The other thing is that oftentimes you'll have, let's say you buy a piece of equipment for your grant, and the reimbursement takes 3 months, like you're sitting on that capital for 3 months. You can't use it anywhere else in your business.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really painful. And so we kind of solve that problem. Like what a lot of our customers, we're now on the 41st transaction that we've done.
Amazing.
And a lot of our customers, what they sort of speak to is how it helps them move a lot faster on the project. It helps them free up liquidity elsewhere in their business. It helps them make decisions like hiring decisions where you can't really hire someone and then wait to get reimbursed.
Right.
Like,
I want to give folks some context too. If you're a longtime SunCast listener, then you probably listened to last March. to the interview with Karen Calvino of Renew CO2. And they are backed by our friends at Energy Transition Ventures. And she spoke specifically to this problem. Exactly this is why she took venture debt on.
And this is what we're trying to help with, right?
Exactly. So like, let's put it in that box. Yeah. Let's talk about how this would have been an option for her if she had known about it.
So historically, before we existed, what founders could do, they had sort of two options. One is just work on the reimbursement timeline and hope you have enough balance sheet to handle it, or go raise venture capital in advance of this grant, which is stupid expensive.
Yeah. And dilutive.
Right? And so what we do is we say, okay, hey, you could raise venture capital, and which has like, at a pre-seed, seed, Series A stage, anywhere from a 40 to 100% IRR effective cost, or you could borrow money from us at 16.5% with no dilution.
To be clear, like, there are very good reasons for both options. Like, there are very good reasons why it makes sense for Karen to take money from Energy Transition Ventures. It's not me saying she shouldn't have taken that deal,
right?
Because in the episode, she explains what a great asset having those investors have been and the connections they've made, right? Like, it's not one for one.
Look, we're also not a replacement for venture capital. Like, most of our clients raise VC and they also raise our money. This allows them to dramatically reduce their dilution and their effective cost of capital across their business. And also, maybe like a shameless plug here, like, we don't just provide money. So we have a co-investor network of over 300 firms now.
Amazing.
We help people raise other capital. Like, we're probably about as active as any VC you've ever.
It also moves the goalpost, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you need to raise capital from a venture, if you need to raise venture capital, you're going to need to raise venture capital no matter what. You're not going to really be able to, unless you get lucky and get a signature client. Even still, if you're creating some sort of hardware, VC is in your pathway. And this moves the goalpost. If you were going to do it in August, you might be able to extend that till August of 25, right? And then
and you'll have
improve your
metrics.
Valuation, you get better leverage, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So I'm selling for you. I totally get it, man. I love this.
I know,
product.
man. You need a job.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is, like, I asked you to come on. You're a completely different type of interview than I normally do on SunCast, because I believe that if there are competitors to what you're doing, they should raise their hand right now, and I'll have them on and I'll brag about them. But I remember listening to the interview with Alina going, holy crap, why didn't anybody do this yet? And they have, just not in our sector, right? It's not like this is a brand new idea, but it provides liquidity specifically in this area. And this is the box I wanted to draw around it. It provides liquidity specifically in this area where you're trying to create something hard. Hard tech is, you're going to go after grants and you're trying to find non-dilutive equity. And often it will go exceedingly slowly. Karen Calvino said if she had had the capital she needed, she could have brought to market her product 18 months sooner.
Yeah.
And you're in a race. You said at the beginning, we're in a foot race against climate.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's been really, I don't know, rewarding to see how founders react to our offering. And I can't even count how many people we've talked to who are like, man, if I had known about you 2-3 years ago when I did this, I would be in such a different place now.
Oh yeah.
And so we're like excited to do this for folks. And the next step is to expand this sort of like what we lend against beyond grants.
That's right. What is underwritten? That is the right next question, and it's further down in my question list. But let me ask a few other questions I think that are important.
Sure.
Because you can address them in a way I rarely ask the question, what is climate tech? So I'm going to go there first. And I think that we have to make an assumption around what climate tech is, what does it encapsulate, so that folks, look, the goal, if you're listening to this episode, you're listening because you're looking for tools to help you accelerate your business or your personal journey. And you're also constantly filling out the checklist of like, do I qualify for what they're talking about? Does it fit inside of my box? Am I doing this right? So let's just define the perimeters around what is climate tech broadly, and then perhaps where you see the kinds of businesses that tend to go after these grants that you end up backstopping or accelerating.
So we define climate tech very, very broadly by design.
Yeah.
So for us, anything that contributes to a reduction of emissions, a removal of emissions, or improves like adaptation and resilience for communities is in scope for us. You're either helping to stop it, you're helping to reverse it, or you're helping people adapt. It could be direct or indirect. So like if you're part of an ecosystem, if you're helping solar companies sell stuff better, you're like a sales SaaS platform, that's in scope for us. If you are a low carbon diaper company, that's in scope for us. If you help keep streams from overflowing when there's flooding, that's in scope for us. All of that is in scope for Enduring Planet.
And so how much on a per ticket size do you have like thresholds, like a minimum? Like what are you typically deploying?
So today we write checks from 100 to 500K. And actually all of this is on our website. So if you go to our website, we have our term sheet public. We try to be as transparent as physically possible so people can see exactly what they're applying for before they try to get capital. So today where we write checks between 100 and 500K, that number will increase pretty substantially by, call it the middle of this year. Maybe sooner.
What determines that number for you?
So for the grant advance product, it is driven by a few factors. One is, what is the total volume of grant payments that the company expects to get over the next, call it 9 to 12 months? Two is, how much risk is there under any given payment under the grant? So some grants will reimburse you for expenses regardless of what happens, right? Regardless of the outcome, if you're spending within budget, they'll pay you.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, you need to do some like light reporting. You know, maybe you have a quarterly report you submit. The outcome still doesn't matter, but there's like a reporting burden that takes time to review.
Mm-hmm.
And then in some cases, you actually have to like do a thing, and the government has to validate that you've done the thing.
Yeah.
And depending on how well you've done it, they'll pay you different amounts.
Oh, wow.
And so
because I didn't realize you had pay for performance on grants.
So in some cases, like your grant might be, you know, let's say you're getting $1 million from the DOE to demonstrate that your new solar cell has, you know, 18% improved performance. Like that's what you proposed, right? And you might have half of that grant where it's just cost plus reimbursement. They'll pay you, you have to buy your equipment, you have to hire people, it doesn't matter. But then there are these milestones where like, oh, you have to demonstrate that a prototype works at X performance. Then you have to demonstrate that it, you know, does this other thing. Then you have to install it outside and it has to do this thing. And payments are tied to those moments. And so in those cases, we spend a lot of time underwriting the individual receivables under the grant to say, okay, what is the chance that you don't get paid this? And then probably beyond that, like, what is the chance that you're not solvent like at the time that this payment will come?
Yeah.
So like we're trying to underwrite both the risk under the grant and also the liquidity risk of the business that's applying.
How do you assess that actuarial risk?
Oh man, that's like kind of part of our secret sauce.
Okay.
But we have both a technology product that we've built to do very rapid financial underwriting. And then we have a very, very talented analyst team that reviews the grant, the sort of like underlying receivables. Over time, the goal is to automate as much of that contract review process as possible. And like today, it takes us about a week to get to term sheet, unless there's like weird, hairy stuff on the deal.
That's pretty quick.
And it takes us about a month to fund, and which is really fast. But it's not as fast as I'd like it to be. And so my goal is to compress that whole process to like 5 business days. So you win a grant, you apply for money, and that week you have funding.
That's amazing.
That's like my dream. And so a lot of what we need to do then is to be able to really quickly assess the sort of like documentation for a grant, which is where we spend a lot of time today.
Yeah. At what stage in a typical SME's journey are you meeting and or injecting capital into their business?
Oh man, we go as early as like we've done a deal with two founders coming out of a lab with a Cal Seed grant
Yeah.
where
Love
they had
Calseed.
like nothing. And they rocked it and then raised the seed round and or just crushing it.
Yeah.
And
Is
then
this a father
or
son duo?
no, but that's funny. Yeah, and then we've also gone as late as like we have one customer that we actually just did our second transaction with, and they have a contract with the Department of Defense. That's like it's a grant, although it almost feels like a procurement contract. And I mean, they're like, I would say, if I had to put them in a stage, they're like Series A plus,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of that is governed by our ticket size.
Yeah.
So for now, because we're still relatively early, we can't do these like big ticket deals where, there are folks who win grants I mean, there are public companies who win grants,
Yeah.
right? Like we as our ticket size grows, our ability to serve these later stage players gets much more exciting.
When you think about the landscape in which you operate, what needed to be true? Timing is everything in this, right? And you've watched the ecosystem grow around energy access to rural communities. In the same way, you're watching the ecosystem grow around capital access to climate tech entrepreneurs. Over the last 5, 10, 15 years, what needed to be true in order for your business to succeed?
Oh, good question. I mean, one, I think the landscape for like government spending on climate needed to get to where it is now. It has been growing pretty substantially in the last, call it 5 years.
Yeah.
And I mean, now there's 20 billion a year in state or federal grants in climate, and there's hundreds of billions a year in procurement spending by government.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going next. So like, we'll expand from grant advances to any government purchase of climate tech products or services will lend against it. And so those are very large markets. And I think things like the IRA, the CHIPS Act, infrastructure bills here in the US and in Europe, the Green New Deal in Europe, like all of this guaranteed spending plays a big role.
Yeah.
I also think that overall the ecosystem needed to mature to a point where there were enough people trying to do the work, right? So like, I don't think this business would have been as successful 10 years ago because just the industry wasn't there to absorb the capital. And then I think the last piece is that technology has come a really long way. And, it was not so easy, even 10 years ago, to pull financial data through an API that was like easy to clean and manage and sort of predict on. And like the kind of automation that we've been able to build in such a limited like span of time 10 years ago would not have been possible.
Yep.
And so that means that like, if I'd started this business 10 years ago, like it would take us, I don't know, 3 to 6 months to do a deal as opposed to 30 days.
You mentioned you just did your 41st deal. Could you give us some insight into more or less how much capital you've been able to deploy thus far? And then are there any success stories that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah. So at 41, I think the total volume is a little under 12 million. So we're pretty proud of that. That's coming out of our first sort of pilot vehicle, which is only a $5.5 million vehicle.
So that means you've had some turnover in the
oh yeah
vehicle.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, we've recycled the full
yeah.
facility, and we'll continue to do that. So it's a 5-year vehicle, and we're only on our second year. I mean, it's been, I don't know, there's lots of success stories. Like we've now done 2, and in some cases 3 transactions with the same people on the same grant, on different grants. Like people come back to us for money, which is probably the greatest validation we could have.
For sure. Repeat customers is a great validation.
yeah, our customers have gone on to raise substantially larger sums from VCs and project finance
Do
investors.
you,
They've
we
Yeah,
talked
go
about what
ahead.
it would have meant for folks if they had found you earlier. Do you have examples where, and you can speak in broad terms, obviously not their exact company name, but like
Yeah.
companies that you've materially helped improve their equity position or their valuation because they were able to work with you rather than taking VC earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard because attribution and like understanding what the sort of counterfactual is really difficult. It's like, oh, you try, the only way to really say that is, hey, you tried to raise a round, you got some pricing that you didn't want, you didn't do it, you took our money, then you raised another round. Like
So
that
no
would be a
examples of
perfect
that yet.
experiment.
Yep.
Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to be careful
Sure.
because I think oftentimes investors take credit for shit that they shouldn't take credit for,
I love that. I
right?
love that you're
Like,
willing to say
is
that.
it really fair for me to say that my 500K loan like resulted in this company getting the valuation that they got 6 months later? Probably not,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, but the fact that they were able to wait 6 months to raise it and they were able to complete, their phase two SBIR and get themselves to another technical readiness level like TRL, all of that meant that they could go and get a better deal
Right.
with the market.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, we have, I think most of our borrowers have gone on to raise other funding,
Yeah.
and our loan played a role in them getting other funding.
Is there an example where because they worked with you, they didn't have to go raise other funding? Like it actually gave them escape velocity?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Can you point
yeah.
to one?
I mean,
I'd love to
well,
hear like a physical
escape velocity. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Like most of the folks that we work with have to raise other money
Mm-hmm.
because they
By the
don't.
nature of the thing they're doing, which
By the
necessitated them
nature,
going to get
yeah,
grants.
yep, yeah. I mean, the in our grant portfolio, in our grant advance portfolio, I think everyone except maybe one company is doing really, really frontier research and development and commercialization work.
I need to go get a
And they
freaking
are,
DOE grant.
dude, it's we have one borrower that is I would call like a small business out of Colorado, that's profitable. And our we've done multiple grant advances with them because they keep winning grants from the state of Colorado, and they have not really had to raise other capital
Yeah.
because of us. And so, but that's a unique case. That's like a small business that is winning grants, that is otherwise profitable. They just need the working capital because, like, oh, you win a grant to buy a bunch of equipment, like, but you don't have the liquidity. You can't really do anything about it. It like just sits there.
You're in Portland now, I mentioned earlier. Where'd you grow up?
I have lived a lot of places. So I was born in Russia. I grew up in
Mhm.
Moscow until I
No way.
was 9.5. And then I moved to Jersey, of all places, which I have very fond memories of, but don't live in now.
Uh-huh.
And then I did the Peace Corps in Latin America, and so I lived in Honduras for 2 years,
Yeah.
and
Of Central
really,
America.
yeah, I really love that. And then I ended up in the Bay for grad school and stayed there for almost a decade.
Yeah. Grad school at Stanford,
But
is that right?
Berkeley,
Berkeley. Sorry.
cold, bro, cold.
Couldn't help it. Oh, anybody that's in the Bay Area will get it. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm like red now. Look at that.
I love it. I love it.
What? I'm sorry. I couldn't help it. Oh my God, that was fun.
You got to leave that in. Don't.
I
cut
will.
that.
I will. I
Don't
totally
cut-
will leave
yeah.
that in. So I actually am. I don't always ask this question, but you have such a really interesting background. What career path did you think you would go down, but didn't? Like you always thought, I'm going to do this.
I've had like probably a dozen of those. I feel like there's like at every junction point, I think I'm going to do one thing, and then I end up doing a different thing.
Yeah.
So when I was in undergrad, I wanted to be a journalist for a while, and then I wanted to be a forensic anthropologist for a while, and I kind of ended up in ecology and really more like specifically restoration ecology.
Mm.
Like I wanted to go and save degraded ecosystems.
Yeah.
And then when I ended up in the Peace Corps, I realized that my kind of, for me personally, like the driver wasn't actually saving the planet, because the planet on a planetary timescale will just
Yeah.
be fine. Like we could nuke the Earth into nothing, and then in a billion years, it won't matter anymore.
Yeah.
But people will suffer. People will acutely suffer and disproportionately suffer across the world. And so that became like a driver for me. And so I said, okay, I'm going to work on, I'd done sort of energy access work in the Peace Corps. And I was like, okay, getting people clean electricity in emerging markets seems like a really exciting thing to work on.
Yeah.
And when I left the Peace Corps, I was like, oh, the lever that I think I can pull on is like policy. It's like the biggest, meatiest lever. It can have real impact. And then I actually started doing policy work, and I realized that I could not stand like 80% of it.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, well, what's another lever? And I was like, oh, maybe it's money. And
Mm.
at the time, if you'd asked me at the start of my grad school career if I would ever work in finance, I would have been like, fuck no.
Mm.
And by the time I graduated, I'd written my master's thesis on project finance, actually with an advisor from Stanford and an advisor from Berkeley.
That's super cool.
So, and then I like ended up working at a big tech company,
Yeah.
which was also not expected. I thought I was going to do a PhD, and I kind of had this opportunity fall in my lap.
Did you get Meta? Did you get recruited out of Berkeley for Meta?
It yes and no. So like they were starting to think about an energy access program, and they had an intern from Haas who I was friends with, and he asked me for advice. And when he presented to me what they were going to do, my reaction was like, dear God, please don't do this.
Don't do this.
And his answer to me, which I still appreciate, it's been 10 years. He was like, well, if you don't want it to be this way, why don't you do it?
Yeah.
If we're going to hire a program manager to build this thing, why don't you come in and do it differently? And I said, well, all right, I'll apply. And I was already struggling with the idea that I would like stay in academia for another 5 years. And so that was kind of the like opportunity, and I took it, and it ended up working out really incredibly. But even now, like I look back at pre-pandemic 2020, and I would not have imagined being an entrepreneur. I have a kid. I have like being a founder as a dad, and especially with a mortgage, like it's terrifying. And
yes,
I don't think I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have the backing of Enduring Ventures and their venture studio. Like it wasn't even a thought, because like, how are you going to pay for life when you don't make any money?
How did you meet Erin?
So Erin and I,
and describe who she is, because we haven't introduced her.
Yeah. So Erin is my co-founder. She is, she is like the credit person in our company. And she also has a really incredible network and experience raising debt capital. And so she's kind of like the debt credit investment person in the leadership team. And Erin and I met in 2016. She actually pitched me for her debt fund while I was at Facebook.
Yeah.
And I met with her and her co-founders at the time. And we didn't end up working together for various reasons, but we kind of stayed in touch. And then when I had this sort of opportunity to start Enduring Planet, I reached out to her and said, hey, I would like to build this company, and I'm looking for someone who really knows credit. And ideally, I'm looking for a co-founder who's not another white guy, because I don't want to just build a team of all white guys. And I was really asking her for advice. I was like, do you know anyone? And I just got lucky. Like, so she had just had a baby and was coming off maternity leave, and had this like break after 6 years of building her last vehicle. So she started this firm called SEMA. They raised like $200 million for lending to clean tech companies in emerging markets. And I just got lucky. And she was like, well, I could be interested.
Yeah.
And then we started talking and we realized that we were really different people
Huh.
in a way that was very complementary for building something like this. And within like 2 months, we were working full time on Enduring Planet.
What does she bring to the table that you don't? Like, what does she compliment you on?
Oh man, so much.
Everything, she would say.
Yeah, everything. No, so we have very different personalities,
Mm-hmm.
and I would say, very like impulsive and fast and
Mm-hmm.
uh, emotional, which I think has value, but sometimes does not.
Yeah.
And Erin is very like deliberate and methodical
Uh-huh.
and thoughtful and like risk averse.
Yeah.
And so you kind of need both personalities
Yeah.
to like build a startup, because sometimes you have to just do shit and sometimes you have to really manage risk, especially in a fintech business.
Yeah.
Erin is also a real credit person. I pretend to be. And so you can't build a lending business without a real credit person, and she is that.
Yeah.
And then also Erin had raised concessionary and blended capital before at a scale that I had not. And like really knew what it took to put money together and bring it in from different sources and balance the needs of different types of investors. And so that's why we were able to raise our first vehicle in basically record time.
Yeah. Sounds
and
like
at a price point that was very compelling.
From an archetype perspective, you're the visionary, she's the integrator. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say that. I think we're like both people who do and both people who dream. We just do it differently.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that that's actually more, in some ways, I think it's more powerful because we're able to distribute the business in such a way where we're both doing. We just do different things.
Right.
And we balance each other. So like, I don't think there's been a decision that we've made within the company that has not been collective in 3 years.
You mentioned immigrating with your family from Russia, but I didn't ask, how big is your family? Any siblings?
I have a brother.
Just the
He's
two of you?
also just the two of us. Yeah, he lives in the Bay. He's also what I would say like a sustainability professional.
Also an
so
entrepreneur?
He built a company. He's also an entrepreneur. Yeah,
Oh,
he
fun.
built a company called Supply Shift, which he recently sold to Sphera.
Congratulations, brother.
Yeah, congratulations, brother. It was a, I think they were building it for like 11 years. But it's probably the leading supply chain sustainability, supply chain management, like supply chain risk management platform in the market. And in many ways, like his journey kind of inspired me as well. I've been like following in his footsteps since undergrad. So he like did the applied ecology program at Rutgers, and then I came in 6 years later and did the same program. And then he moved to California, and I moved to California, and he became an entrepreneur, and then eventually I became an entrepreneur. And
he got a PhD, and then you got it. Oh,
I tried to get a PhD. He talked me out of getting a PhD.
He did. I've talked to so many people out of going back to school.
I think that, I probably don't say this enough to him, but yeah, his perspective and experience and path were incredibly influential on my own.
And he's your big brother.
And he's my big brother, so he's 6 years older than me. And then, I have my parents here in the US, and then we still have some family, sort of now less so in Russia since the war, but sprinkled around.
What a blessing. That's a cool story, that you can share that experience with your brother, and that you also get to celebrate him. That's really cool to be able to have someone in your family have that success. Let's look at a couple of sort of thinking about the business model again for Enduring Planet and the kinds of customers that you're looking for. Perhaps just the words of wisdom, advice, as it were. If you have a business with revenue, but not profitability, from your experience, what are the things that as a business owner you need to keep in mind?
whenever you sort of build a company, um, I can speak to the like
Yeah.
financial
Specific.
elements of this. I'm not going to talk to the like, sales or designing your
Hmm.
product,
I
whatever.
mean,
I
financially.
think that generally, yeah, I think generally founders overestimate how quickly they will get to their next
Mm.
milestone. They underestimate how much it will cost to get there. And they overestimate their ability to secure the capital they need to
Hmm.
be successful. And so they spend less time investing in good financial infrastructure to enable them to succeed. And so, like, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to founders who like don't have good
Yeah.
bookkeeping. They don't have a model of their business that tells them when they're going to run out of cash. They um, are like, oh, I have 6 months of runway. I'm going to start fundraising in 3 months. Like, those are all things you shouldn't do. And this is part of the reason why we also launched. So we talked a lot about our
Right.
lending business. We launched this advisory business, which we call the sort of enduring plan of fractional CFO or enduring plan CFO, where we do that for climate entrepreneurs. So we provide bookkeeping and accounting, modeling, financial planning analysis, and like strategic advisory work to help founders, often technical founders, like navigate
Yeah.
this universe because it's not
Well,
intuitive. Like I think a lot of people sort of think like, oh, I'll
and
just
there's
figure it out.
and
Like
there's not
money's
an off-the-shelf
intuitive.
financial
Like
model you can just bolt on.
no. And people who tell you that, like be very careful because what often happens is founders will go and they'll like find some template bullshit thing on the internet and they'll like stick their stuff in there and they'll just hand it off
Right.
to investors and be like, this is my model. And the thing is that like if you did that with your product, your customers
Right.
would laugh at you. And you have to treat money the
Yeah.
same way. There's definitely shortcuts you can take, and there are ways to do it cheaper. But in the end, managing money should be as important to you as building your product, as selling to customers, as developing a brand. Like it should not take a back seat. And this is kind of my advice is like start way
Yeah.
earlier, right? Be thoughtful about how you're going to finance your business early because what you'll find is if you leave it till later and you kind of cobble it along, you might find yourself at a point where you're really ready to go, like you're really ready to
Yeah.
scale, but the capital won't come because of choices you've made 3, 5,
Yeah.
10 years ago.
That's really wisdom in a bottle right there, man. From somebody who's definitely seen enough, enough.
Been
Yeah.
there, done that.
I mean, it's the pattern. I tell people all the time, it's the pattern matching that matters. And that's why a lot of folks get value from working with venture partners, because venture partners, more than anything else, they have great pattern matching. They have an excellent network. They can tell you, they see the mistakes miles ahead, right? You see the minutes ahead.
Yeah.
So as we kind of round third base here, I'm curious about the kinds of resources that you routinely recommend for founders or even friends that you know who are in business. And I'm particularly thinking, yesterday I had an entrepreneur mention venture deals and said that she wished she had read venture deals before she raised her seed. Thankfully, she read it before she raised her A. What other sort of resources like that would you recommend?
So, I mean, one is we publish a series once a week on Tuesdays to provide founders tactical and like actionable advice on capital and ops in
Mm-hmm.
climate. So it's enduringplan.com/insights. It's like our insights series.
Okay.
People can sign up. You don't have to sign up. Doesn't matter. We
Yep.
publish it every Tuesday. And we actually, for every piece, we talk to an expert in the market around a specific like niche topic, building your data room, raising money from family
Oh,
offices, navigating an asset purchase,
yeah. People should probably
asset
ignore all
financing
this advice right
agreement.
now at
Yeah.
your peril.
Yeah. At your peril. Yeah. And so,
That's
so
cool.
that's one. Two is, there are some fellowship programs that we've seen in the market, like Climate Base has a fellowship program. There's also Climate Vine, which is sort of a community group where there are cohorts that get together and people sort of build together. There's TerraDo's coursework in the space. There's a lot of resources to like upskill yourself as an
Yeah.
entrepreneur. I think there's so much content. It's kind of
Yeah.
sometimes hard to parse.
There's a
But I
podcast
think
on
that
climate capital too, I've heard of.
there's a Climate Capital podcast where I'm a guest host, and we talk to founders about their journeys. Like, I think maybe the message here is like, as an entrepreneur, it probably makes sense for you to dedicate, I don't know, 3 hours a week to learning
Yeah.
shit. Not about your product, not about your customer. Like, separate it and dedicate time to kind of like upskilling yourself. And that could be coaching time if you can afford a coach. It could be coursework. It could be reading. But in the end, if all you do is hustle, which I'm very guilty of. Like, I've had 6 months, 9 months where I haven't read anything, I haven't
Yeah.
listened to anything. I'm just like in the zone. And honestly, like, it feels like the right thing to do in the moment. But if you look back, you're like, man, if I had read this blog randomly, I would have had an insight that would have maybe saved
Yeah.
me trouble later. Right. And I think it helps to
Yeah.
create that space.
Well, it's also it's a good, I call it like keystone habit. So I often ask, and I'll follow that prompt with, is there a consistent habit or practice in your life that has given you yield, like leverage? It has created an impact on the way you work because of this thing that you consistently do?
I have a few. So I think, like, I'm gonna get rid of the obvious. Like, I think you should exercise as much as you physically can. Like, I bike to work, so I get like 8 miles a day of biking, and then I try to climb once a week, if
Yeah.
not more.
Rock
That's
climbing.
been really helpful for me.
Yeah.
Rock climbing, yeah. Every time I stop doing that, I like, my body turns to shit, my brain turns to shit. But actually, one habit that is kind of not so common or obvious is that I don't generally work at night or on the weekends.
Yeah.
So, like, my work is restricted to the time that I'm in the office. I mean, obviously, as like a CEO, I'm like kind of constantly looking at Slack or email, but I unless there's something that needs urgent
Mm-hmm.
attention, that time is restricted to like my kid
Yeah.
and my house and my wife and my family, and like, not work. And what that has done is it has forced me to be hyper efficient when I do
Yeah.
work. And my productivity during working hours is like, I can't even
Mm-hmm.
describe it compared to what it used to be when I was like, oh, I work whenever,
Right.
I
I'll
work
just take
all the
care of that this
time.
evening
Like,
because,
yeah, no, like, you just get
yeah.
shit done. And it has been kind of transformative.
How long
for
have
me.
you had that sort of mentality, that transformation?
Since I think since we basically moved and I've had to not work in an office, like, since I left Facebook, I've been like, oh, I have an office. Like, I sit in an office. I don't work from
Mm-hmm.
home. Mostly because my wife can't listen to me on Zoom calls all day. She's like, I can't. You're loud. You do stressful stuff. I can't fucking deal with it. And so, but I also, it creates a
Yeah.
separation, and the separation is really powerful. And it means that I can be more present with my kid. It means I'm more present at work. It means I'm more present with my partner. It means that, like, it also means that stuff just has to happen when like, if I'm like, oh, in this hour, I'm going to do this task, it just has to happen. I can't let it sit, you know?
I'm sure more than a few folks are going to want to reach out. Are you easily accessible on LinkedIn, or where do you like to be found?
I am. Yeah. LinkedIn, Twitter.
Yeah.
You can also
you're very
email
active
me at,
on X, more so than I would say, like, more so than the average like climate tech person. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, I actually find that your engagement on X is higher than average, and I most engage with your content, as it were, on X.
yeah, I think historically, and I don't know, I have like a very weird relationship with Twitter. I'm not even going to call it X,
It's fine.
so don't ask. But I actually like LinkedIn better as a platform. I find that the engagement, the quality of engagement there is higher, but it feels like table stakes to post on
Yeah.
both. Um, but people can find me there. They can find me, they can just
Yeah.
email me, Dimitry, Dimitry at enduringplanet.com. Or like the contact at
Mm-hmm.
enduringplanet.com. We also have a contact form. I try to be as accessible as I physically can because I think that this is also one of the like sad things in the finance industry is that people are just really hard to reach and they like have this like weird
Yeah.
gait. And so it creates these really disproportionate impacts on especially underrepresented founders and folks who don't have the social capital to like get at you through your, whatever. And so yeah, I if I can't help, I can't help, but you generally can reach me and I'm generally very
Yeah.
responsive.
As we wrap, I'd like to ask you one final question. If we look out to, let's just say 2050, and we've been able to successfully put that cap on our atmosphere that we all hope we can, and let's assume that we did everything right with around climate tech, funding it, etc. What do you think are the couple of things that we got right that right now are standing in our way? They're hurdles, but we got them right. We solved it. What do you think those are? The potential that they potentially will keep us from getting there.
I mean, honestly, I think only two things do that. One is putting a price on carbon that all of society has to bear. And the other is deciding that we are not comfortable with the notion that hundreds of millions or I don't know, however many people need to suffer for some degree of maintenance of status quo. Like, I think we need to sort of decide that we can no longer allow externalities to be mispriced in this market, right? Like, if you're going to emit, you have to pay. And two, that the poor, the disenfranchised, the underprivileged are not going to be left behind. And if we decide those two things, we'll be just fine. But, your guess is as good as mine when we decide to do that.
Well, as we decide to take action on those things, we're covering it here on SunCast. Dimitry Gershenson is the co-founder and CEO of Enduring Planet. Such a pleasure to have you on the show, my friend. Thanks for sharing from your book of wisdom.
Thanks, Nico. I really appreciate it.
I want to say that while it was a somewhat modified, slightly different version of how SunCast interviews are typically carried out, that was a really interesting, deep insight into the world of working capital for climate tech ventures. Dimitry, thank you for helping explain what climate tech actually means and how erstwhile entrepreneurs can find access to accelerated capital while seeking non-dilutive grant funding for the ideas that we want to bring into the world to keep the world below 2 degrees C in temperature rise. Thank you for listening as well. It's not lost on me that you've given up the last hour of your life hoping for nuggets of wisdom that would help drive your business or your career forward. I hope that you found them here. Hope that sacrifice was worth it. And if it was, I would love it if you would take 2 more minutes and just hit the review button or the like button or subscribe in whatever app or podcast player or video tool you're watching on right now. And if you do have an extra 2 minutes, leave us a review, because that rating and review actually helps other intelligent seekers like yourself find SunCast. We've got nearly 700 episodes of deep information from folks like Dimitry, helping you on the front lines of the clean energy and climate transition, the war that we're waging against history and against other prior poor decisions, but against the decisions that we in favor of the decisions we all can make together. We've got a ton of resources. There were a bunch that Dimitry rattled off there at the end: Climate Vine, their Insights newsletter, Climate-Based Fellowship. We'll link to all those in the description in the podcast app you're listening to. We'll also link to them over in the show notes at mysuncast.com. And that is also where you can find information from our sponsors. They help make sure this show is free to you each and every week so that you can enjoy it with paying the one thing that does cost you something, but not financial. It's your attention. Thank you for giving us your time over the last 60 minutes. I am so grateful for you. Remember, you are what you listen to. Thanks again for showing up, Solar Warrior. It's half the battle.